When I was 16 years old, my dad took my bedroom door off its hinges. And for 3 months, I had no bedroom door. Why? Because he thought I was trying to be too much of an individual. That experience rewired my brain to believe that saying no wasn't safe, that my wants, needs, and preferences were subservient to his. Now, if you find that you can't say no without justifying, explaining, or apologizing, or if you find yourself constantly anticipating other people's needs or looking for their validation, for acceptance, your brain might be stuck in a similar pattern. And today, we're talking about how people pleasing can literally be damaging your brain and what you can do about it. So, without further ado, let's get started. Well, hi there, Amy here. Thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome back to another episode. This is episode 302 of Happy and Healthy with Amy. So, if this is your first time checking out this podcast, this is a space where we explore evidence-based ways to take care of your brain health, to optimize your brain health and prevent cognitive decline. Okay, so in the last episode, I talked about how social connection protects your brain. And combined with all the other modifiable risk factors, we're talking about being able to reduce your risk of dementia by at least 45%. And the more we're finding, the more we're researching different risk factors, that number keeps going up. And Dr. Dean Scherzay has actually said that 90% of dementia cases he believes could be prevented. All right? But here's what I didn't unpack in the last episode, and that is the quality of the relationships matter. In other words, not all relationships protect your brain. Some actually damage it. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the people pleaser's trap. So this is really about when you say yes, when you really mean no, when you want to say no, and how that changes your brain. All right? Now, I know that some of you may be thinking, people pleasing? Right? Isn't that just being nice? How could being nice be bad for my brain? Well, let me tell you about something that happened to me when I was 16 years old that really made a huge difference on my early adult life. So when I was 16 years old, I remember that my dad and I had this back and forth for a few weeks where I wanted to sleep with my bedroom door closed. And my dad wanted me to leave it open. And for 3 days in a row, we had this back and forth of me closing it part way and then him opening it. He got to the point, he got so frustrated with me. He told me I was trying to be too much of an individual, and he literally took my bedroom door off at the hinges. And for 3 months, I had no bedroom door. All right. Now, mind you, I wanted to close the bedroom door because my bedroom was right across from the bathroom, and we had a nightlight, and that light bothered me. But my dad didn't care. So for 3 months, I had no door, right? No privacy. I ended up getting dressed in my walk-in closet with the door closed there. So I don't think my dad is big on empathy, and I don't think he realized that as a 16-year-old girl, I really felt a little awkward at the time, right? So I basically had no physical boundary between where I was sleeping and the rest of the house. And ultimately, what I got from that was that my wants and needs didn't seem to matter to him. My wanting boundaries was ultimately unacceptable. And the lesson I learned was that if I didn't keep him happy, the consequences were pretty severe. Right? So that single experience rewired my brain for decades. And if you're someone who struggles to say no, right, you might actually feel really anxious when you think about disappointing someone. Or maybe you find yourself constantly anticipating other people's needs. Like you're always trying to figure out what they expect. Your brain might be stuck in a similar pattern. So let's talk about what's actually happening in your brain when you're stuck in people-pleasing mode, which of course, that was something that I was struggling with. So for years after that bedroom door incident, I lived with this belief, this unconscious belief, that my safety depended on keeping my dad happy. So I would say yes, even when I really wanted to say no. Again, I was always trying to figure out what he wanted. And it wasn't until my early 30s when I started seeing a psychologist, Dr. Pam Oblidinger. I actually talked about her in episode 1. I worked with her for about 3 years. And it was during this time with her that I finally understood what it meant to create healthy boundaries and really a stronger sense of who I was and what I was about. And then years later, this is back in like 2004, I started volunteering with American Red Cross. And I remember when I joined the Leadership Council for San Mateo County, one of my mentors, Al Malamo, gave me advice that was really important as a volunteer for the Red Cross. He said, and I remember very clearly, that the Red Cross will keep asking you for your time. And you need to remember that no is a complete sentence. You don't have to explain why you're saying no. You don't have to come up with an excuse. You can just say no. And because of the boundary work that I had done with Pam, with Dr. Oblidinger, I could actually receive that wisdom, right, and implement it. But I know for so many people, those words really feel impossible to live by. So I want to help you change that today. Okay, so something that I think isn't actually said out loud is that people-pleasing is actually a form of self-abandonment. That sounds really harsh, right? But let's sit with this for a little bit. Let me unpack this for you, all right? So people-pleasing is clearly a learned survival mechanism, right? Where you're constantly suppressing your own needs, desires, emotions, and even your values in order to gain acceptance, right? To feel safe or to avoid conflict. So when your nervous system learns early that your safety depends on keeping other people happy, it gets wired for hypervigilance around other people's emotions. So when we talk about the stress response, you probably have heard of fight or flight, right? There's actually 4 though. There's fight, flight, freeze, and then fawn. So the fawn response is actually all about appeasing others to manage potential conflict or danger. Right? So hypervigilance means your brain is constantly scanning, like, are they upset? Did I do something wrong? How can I fix this? Right? So this creates a state of chronic stress, and it's really as harmful to your brain as any physical stressor. So when you're in people-pleasing mode, your brain is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. Remember, these are the same stress hormones that when they're chronically elevated, when you're on that cortisol drip, will shrink your hippocampus, right? This is your brain's memory center. And it also impairs your ability to think clearly. But here's what's really tricky about people pleasing. It feels virtuous. So we can tell ourselves we're being kind, selfless, and caring. And society actually rewards it. I think especially for women. Oh, she's being so helpful, right? So giving. But meanwhile, your brain is literally rewiring itself for anxiety, resentment, and burnout. And here's where Brene Brown's research becomes crucial. So she makes a really important distinction between fitting in and true belonging, right? We talk about how important connection is, but connection needs to be true belonging. So fitting in is adapting who you are to be accepted by others. So Brene Brown calls it a hollow substitute for connection because it requires you to put up a false front. Right? So people pleasing is essentially chronic fitting in. And it's ultimately unsustainable because it leads to feeling lonelier and not more connected. It's like basically you're having to wear a mask, and you can only be accepted when you're wearing that particular mask, right? That persona. On the other hand, true belonging is a deep internal sense of peace that comes from accepting yourself completely. And it gives you the courage to be your authentic, imperfect self, even if it means standing alone sometimes. So when you're stuck in people-pleasing patterns, again, you're choosing fitting in over true belonging. And your brain pays the price. So let me paint you a picture of what chronic people-pleasing does to your cognitive function. Right? When you're consistently in people-pleasing mode, several key things happen. First, you lose connection to your authentic self. So this isn't just psychological, it's neurological. So when you're constantly suppressing your own needs and emotions, you're literally unlearning how to identify what you want, what you think, or what you feel. And how this shows up is in difficulty making decisions. When you have an unclear sense of identity of who you are, you also end up with this persistent feeling that you're only lovable, you're only acceptable if you keep meeting everyone else's needs. Right? So what else? Your brain becomes stuck in chronic anxiety. So that hypervigilance I was talking about, right? You're constantly worrying about what other people think, right? Scanning for signs of disapproval, right? Looking for validation, and then living with really what's a deep fear of abandonment. Again, that loss of connection and belonging. So This hypervigilance, you can see how that would exhaust your prefrontal cortex, right? That part of your brain that's planning and making decisions, right? So when you're consistently overriding your own instincts to please others, you train your brain to distrust your own signals, right? So you lose touch with your interoception, your ability to sense what's happening inside your body. If you're hungry, if you're tired, if you're in pain, right? When you're suppressing how you feel and putting everybody else's needs and wants before your own. And here's the vicious cycle you need to understand is by constantly prioritizing others, you wind up diminishing your own emotional energy, which then fosters a dependence on other people to meet your needs. So you're ultimately increasing the very fear of abandonment you were trying to avoid in the first place. Right? And here's the brain connection that most people miss. When you're in a chronic state of stress from poor boundaries, then you'll wind up having higher levels of inflammation, right? And inflammation has been linked to Alzheimer's. So the very thing that you think is protecting your relationships is actually putting your brain health at risk. And really, I think the most devastating effect of people pleasing is loss of self-trust. So when you consistently override your own instincts to please others, you literally train your brain to distrust its own signals. So you lose touch with what you actually want, need, or feel, right? Your interoception, your ability to sense what's happening inside your body becomes impaired. All right, so now let's talk about the solution. It's boundaries, but not the way most people think about them. So healthy boundaries aren't walls. They're not rigid, and they're not porous either. Okay, they're flexible. They're like bridges to deeper intimacy. So when you can clearly communicate what you need, want, and won't tolerate, you actually create more authentic connections. So here's what happens in your brain when you start setting and enforcing healthy boundaries. First thing, your stress response calms down. So when you stop constantly anticipating other people's reactions, your nervous system can finally relax and your cortisol levels can normalize, can find balance again. So as a result, then, your prefrontal cortex can focus on higher level thinking instead of the constant threat detection. And then when you know and honor your own preferences, wants, and needs, your decision making gets clearer. And as a result, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with self-trust, right? And that internal guidance, right? That North Star. But here's the challenge. I know that setting boundaries after years of people pleasing can feel terrifying because your brain is wired to believe that saying no equals rejection, abandonment, or conflict. And this is where it's vital for you to understand the difference between guilt and fear. So guilt is about, I've done something wrong. Whereas fear is about something bad is going to happen, that anticipation. So when you start setting boundaries, it's very likely you're going to end up feeling both. And that's really your old programming trying to keep you safe by keeping you compliant. But here's what I want you to remember, okay? Your brain is plastic. It can change. That's all about neuroplasticity, right? So the same neuroplasticity that got you stuck in people-pleasing patterns can get you unstuck. Okay, so every time you say no, when you mean no, right? Think integrity here. Every time you express a preference, every time you honor your own needs, you're literally rewiring your brain for healthier relationships. Right? So now let's talk about some practical steps to rewire your brain. And here are 3 evidence-based strategies. Strategy number 1 is the pause. Okay, so before you automatically say yes to any request, I want you to insert a pause. You can practice saying, let me check my calendar and get back to you, right? So this gives your prefrontal cortex time to engage instead of your automatic stress response. Okay, so to be clear, the goal here isn't to say no to everything. It's to create space for conscious choice instead of compulsive compliance. All right, strategy number 2 is to start with low stakes boundary setting. Think about like when you go to Starbucks and you place your order, you're expressing your preferences, right? I want a grande drip with room for cream. That's my order. Okay. Matt's is a venti drip with about an inch for room. He wants milk. He doesn't want a sleeve. Double the cup. All right. So when it comes to boundaries, I don't want you to start by confronting your most challenging relationships. We want to begin with strangers or casual acquaintances. Okay. And you can practice saying things like, that doesn't work for me. Or, I'm not available for that. Notice there weren't any excuses or reasons given. So that's the equivalent of no is a complete sentence. Okay? Each time you do this, you're strengthening your boundary setting neural pathways. It's like going to the gym for your self-advocacy muscles. All right? Now, strategy number 3 is to reframe discomfort as growth. So when you feel anxiety after setting a boundary, remind yourself, this discomfort is my brain learning something new, right? I'm literally growing a new neural pathway or pathways right now. And instead of seeing the anxiety as evidence that you've done something wrong or you maybe have something to fear, see it as evidence that you're changing, right? And also notice how other people are responding. So I know that when I worked with Pam, with Dr. Bleidinger, we role played a particular conversation I was having with my dad. And I was telling her how it was this cycle of communication, right? That we would, I can't remember what we were arguing about, but inevitably it turned into an argument. And working with her and coming up with a different response where I was authentic, right? I was able to communicate my wants and needs, probably in a more mature fashion than what I'd been doing up until that point. But what I noticed was also my dad's response was different. And we didn't wind up in an argument. All right. So again, remember my mentor Al Malamo's advice. No is a complete sentence. You don't need to justify, explain, or apologize for having preferences and limits. All right? And then here's something I think is also really important to remember. Tony Gaskins, who's a motivational speaker, has a pretty famous quote. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce. So I want you to remember that as an adult, you're no longer dependent on others the way you were when you were a child, right? So if someone gets angry or tries to manipulate you when you set limits, it may simply be because you haven't done this before, right? So their reaction doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Again, it means you're probably doing something different. And for some people, if they've gotten used to your compliance, this change can be uncomfortable for them too, right? But again, the outcome could also be completely different from what you've experienced in the past. It could be a really positive one, right? So we just want to break the cycle and try something different. Okay, but I want you to remember again that people pleasing isn't really about kindness, right? You're actually being dishonest about your own wants and needs. And the whole reason behind it, that fear, is creating the exact kind of chronic stress that we know can damage your brain, right? Can negatively impact your brain health. So the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and your relationships is to start honoring your own needs and boundaries. Right? So next week, we're diving into another pattern that damages both your relationships and your brain health. And that's attachment trauma. So we'll be exploring why some of us feel like we're walking on eggshells in relationships and how really early childhood experiences have rewired our social brain circuits. So if you found this episode helpful, I would ask that you please share it with someone who might need to hear that their needs matter too. Right? And if you're ready to dive deeper into creating healthy boundaries that take care of both your relationships and your brain health, I'd love to invite you to join the priority list for Second Spring Society. So this is my new membership program for women in midlife who are really ready to answer the question, what do you want? What do you truly want? And often for the first time in decades. So in Second Spring Society, we're not just talking about setting and enforcing healthy boundaries. We're going to be creating your menopause vision statement, right? So really exploring what your second spring, what you want it to look like when you finally are able to put your wants and needs and preferences back in the equation, right? So you can find the link in the show notes or use the QR code on the screen or go to moxiehyphenclub.com/society. So again, if you found this episode helpful and you're watching it on YouTube, I would love for you to hit that like button and subscribe, all right? And share it with someone. The algorithm loves when we do these things. Help other people find this video podcast. All right? So remember, taking care of your brain means taking care of your boundaries. And taking care of your boundaries means ultimately taking care of your relationships. All righty? So I'm going to leave you with a quote by Maya Angelou. If I am not good to myself, how can I expect anyone else to be good to me?